exactly to this day, 150 years ago, on April 3rd, 1872, just about this time of day too, that the very first patients arrived at Elgin Mental Health Center.
Wow.
And those individuals had, does that work?
It works now,
Point it toward the screen.
or to the computer.
To the computer, but it should be on Wi-Fi or whatever this thing's called.
Hang on.
Okay, so this is the slide that goes with, we started more or less. It's 150 years ago to the day, maybe even right to the minute, when the first patients arrived and were greeted by Dr. Kilbourne. And he was 35 years old at the time. This picture was taken a little bit later in life. So he only lived to be just under 53. And a lot of facility directors out there died young. So it's a tough job. Anyway, those individuals were patients that were being transferred from to the state's first, and at that time, only state hospital in Jacksonville, Illinois. Jacksonville is about 35 miles west of Springfield. And at the time, the this hospital was being opened to serve the northern half of the state, the northern third of the state. And the Jacksonville Hospital, which had been in business since before the Civil War, was to serve the central part. And another hospital under construction in Anna, which is way in the southern tip of the state, was going to serve the southern third. So these patients were being brought up little by little to the hospital at Elgin, which was still under construction, by the way. So that was going on exactly 150 years ago, right? Almost right to this minute. Now, so if you ever go by the hospital door, though, it says established in 1869, which it was by act of the legislature. And it was in April too, about a week off of where we're at now. And so it took 3 years from the time that the legislature passed the resolution to do that to be able to open up the hospital over there. So if you go by, it's 1869. And when they made that sign, you know, if you're old, you might as well grab a few extra years. So they did that anyway. Okay, so this is a story of evolution, and the subtitle of my book, both the 1997 version and this version, is History of Elgin Mental Health Center, Evolution of a State Hospital. And when you look back in time, the hospital today is much different than the hospital of 25 years ago. And if you look back another 25 years, which will put you back in the early 1970s, it's a different facility. And if you go back 25 years from that into the 1950s, it is very much a different facility. And as you go further back in about 25 or 30 year increments, the hospital morphs, it changes. And it changes in a lot of different ways. And that's really what I wanted to get across with this lecture. And you can measure those changes in a whole bunch of little indicators. And these are a few. The size, of course, the grounds and the architecture of the grounds, which we're going to talk about a little bit. That'll help lead into some other stories. But the type and number of employees. When the hospital opened, there was only 2 doctors, and there were no nurses, there were no social workers, no psychologists, no activity therapists, no occupational therapists on that. There was attendants, just attendants, and the doctors, and you know, the people that ran the back office stuff, the business guy, the farmer, the guy that ran the power plant and stuff like that. So all that's changed. The reason that people are in the hospital has changed. The reasons of the 19th century, we'll talk about in a few minutes, are different than the reasons people are in the hospital today. So that has also changed. And where the patients come from now, what's the source of them? That's changed. And that's different than at other points in the past. And where do they go after they're in the hospital? That's changed as well too. And the policies that shape the hospital's mission, that's what's been the trigger to this change. So I wanted to explain this, but then as I'm thinking about, you know, there's nothing like a academic lecture on policy and change to get the audience on their feet to bludgeon the speaker. And we don't want that. Absolutely don't want that to happen. So, but the policies are what drive all of this amorphosis, evolution. So, as we get into it, we'll try to explain that a little bit. And of course, the therapies change, and there's a whole bunch of other reasons, a whole bunch of other things that change. So, these are some of the more obvious ones. But when I've looked at this historically, I see these periods in time, and there are about these 6 different phases of the hospital. So if you're talking about the hospital in the 1940s, it's a different hospital than the 1980s, different hospital than the 1880s and that. So, okay. Well, I was asked, why is the Elgin Mental Health Center's history important? Here's a whole bunch of reasons why. I bet you a lot of you don't know there was very important scientific discoveries there in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And largely having to do with medicine, but also having to do with nutrition. And what's the effect of that? Every slice of bread you eat is affected by research that came out of Elgin Mental Health Center, Elgin State Hospital at the time, because it was research into nutrition and into the enrichment of wheat in bread. So, and that was done in conjunction with the World Health Organization in a grant that was funding research out there then. So, and then it was a curious city unto itself. That's what a lot of people remember in that. And so that, and then that city was part of an interesting subculture. There were almost 400 state hospitals in the United States at one point in time. And a half a dozen or more run by the military or county governments or cities in a couple of cases. In big hospitals, I mean, big in the range of 500 to 7,000 patients, analogous to what Elgin was at various points in time. So that story is largely disappearing because most of those places are closed. And most of them have also gone through a similar metamorphosis that's happening at Elgin. So you could, it's an excellent case example of the evolution of state hospitals and by extension, the evolution of mental health care in the United States. You see there? And it's also an interesting lesson in politics and policy because the state hospital, of course, is an offshoot, a wing of state government. And it's affected by the policies of the people that are trying to manage the welfare system. And it's also affected by the politics that go on in the legislature. And it's affected by the larger economy, which we'll talk about a little bit briefly. So I say this is a story of 6 different hospitals. And there's a common threads that run through different places in time. And unfortunately, in a brief hour or so of that, you can only skim the top of this because there's a lot of great material here and a lot of great stories. And I'm not going to get into the juicy ones that people want to hear. I'm not going to get into the war stories. I mean, a lot of people here work there. They can raise their hand. You can buttonhole them later if you want to hear these war stories and that stuff. But this is more of a, sweep, a big picture look and all of that. Am I blocking your view, Jeff? Sandy? I am?
What did you say?
Am I blocking your, are you awake?
No,
Am I blocking your view?
no,
Okay.
we're not.
All right. So we'll start out by dispelling a couple of myths. And one is when that in the late 19th century, it was unenlightened, it was oppressive. The hospitals were, dark, dingy places. That is actually is not the case. It certainly wasn't the case here in Elgin. Excuse me. In this first phase of the hospital's 6-phase evolution, it's the ideal asylum. And two things, it's based on moral treatment and it's based on the Kirkbride plan, which is a design for hospital architecture. So starting off, so what's moral treatment? Well, you could read this book. I read it last night. It's about 500 pages long. 1858 book. And I'll summarize it for you. So you don't have to do that. And it's basically these ideas that came out of Europe where their mental health care was very, very bad in the late 1700s, early 1800s, except for in a few bright spots. In France, where Dr. Pinel was, and in England, which was most influential in the United States, where not a guy named William Tuke was, and he founded a place called the York Retreat for Quakers. He was a Quaker, and that idea is transferred over to the Quaker population of the the Philadelphia area. And that. So these are some of the aspects of moral treatment in terms of dealing with people that have illness. And, you know, these are pretty good values to have. And these are values that are still being, you know, put into place in that for helping people, you know, deal with their illness. And it's just not just mental illness, but other forms of illness. So it's a very enlightened approach to treatment. Now, those ideas began to become coalesce around these 13 guys. These guys were the superintendents of the leading 13 institutions. There were only 20 at the time. In 1844, am I still in frame here for?
You're good.
Okay, because I'll wander around. I'll wander out the door
I'll follow
if
you.
I'm not careful. So
I'll follow you.
these doctors got together and they formed the Association of Medical Superintendents of the American Institutions of the Insane, which evolved into the American Psychiatric Association with 2 or 3 name changes along the way. And each of them had certain specialties that they wanted to impart into the larger knowledge base. And the guy that we're interested in right now is this guy, Thomas Kirkbride. And his specialty was the design of the ideal hospital, the design of the ideal asylum. So he came up with these ideas, the association adopted them, and they started out with the ideal asylum, many, many pages in that book to read too. But these are some of the things that they said. It should be out of the city, should be on the edge of a city. So you had the advantage of the city, but you had room to grow. And it should be a pastoral kind of setting. Don't you ladies want to sit on that wire bench there?
No, we can see better.
Okay, all right. All right, all right. It wanted to use the congregate plan, which meant that they wanted all the hospital operations under one roof because the superintendent then could supervise everything. And I'll show you what the congregate plan looks like in a few minutes. And they wanted at least 8 wards so they could break up the patients by their functioning level and then put them where they classify them and put them where they could, you know, their needs could be met better than just throwing everybody into one room. And they wanted adequate employee housing on site. And they were a lot of discussion about things like sewage systems and water delivery and ventilation and things like that. All those environmental considerations. Because, you know, there's no electricity at the time this is being done. So you have to rely on natural systems to heat and cool, you know, airflow and such and such. And they had that most patients had private rooms. There was a certain level of dignity and privacy that went with it. You know, being in a hospital is not a pleasant experience even today. But you got to say, even today, almost every medical hospital is a private room, and that is a much better than being in a room with other sick person or 2 other sick people or 3 other sick people. So, and the Superintendent's Association wanted the hospital to only be about 250 beds because they thought that was as much as the one doctor could operate. He could supervise the operations and deal with the patients. And they later revised that up to 600 beds if there was assistant physicians to help them out. So these are some of the tenets of an ideal asylum. And this is a picture, floor plan drawing of the hospital at Elgin. This was the ideal asylum. This is what Dr. Kirkbride came up with. And so it's often called the Kirkbride building. And the advantage of this building is many. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Take a picture of it. So, yeah, you'll get glare. You can see that the way it's set up in echelon fashion, it allows for the different wards to be different levels. You can see it was long and linear because that allowed a lot of windows to floor space, allowed for cross ventilation of air moving this way, that way, that way. All of women on one side, men on the other. business office functions up front, and then in the back, there's the kitchens and the storage areas and the scullery and power plant and so on and so forth. All in one building. The superintendent could be roaming the halls because he lived in the building. All the employees lived in the building. Yeah. But I'm going to just zoom in a little bit closer because this sets up for what happens. You can see all of these are patient rooms. And everybody had their own room pretty much. There was a couple of little dormitories, they call them associate dormitories, where maybe suicidal people or people that needed to be watched. They had a couple of other people in them. So these are nice little places. They had dining rooms, sitting rooms, things like that right on the wards. And this is what the hospital looked like. This is with its first wing on this day, April 3rd, 150 years ago. Partially built, and then later the center section and the other section done. So it comes up to full capacity in about 2 or 3 years. And when it came to full capacity with a couple of design changes on the way, it's 450 patients they're treating. So it's the 55th psychiatric hospital in the United States. And of those that came, about 10 years ago, I did a lecture, and Elgin was now it's the last of the 20th or so of the oldest hospital in the country. The other ones have closed or moved on or whatever. Okay, so here's a picture of the grounds, because a big part of the grounds was having these, what they call pleasure grounds. And this is a pretty accurate drawing in 1882 of the grounds, fully landscaped with the lagoon in the front and the walking paths and a couple little buildings on the outside and a farm in the back. So that's a pretty accurate image of it at the time. And I'm going to take you in for a brief, real quick little peek inside that building, because the building's long gone and you don't get to see it very much. And we're really privileged to have a few images of it. This was the assembly hall where, they'd have concerts, lectures, church services, things like that. This is a scrapbook by this guy, Dr. Ritchie, about 1910 or so. And it's Christmas. Here he is with his daughter, and he had a little apartment in the building too. And there's a Christmas tree. And here's the main entry of the building, decked out in Christmas decorations from Dr. Ritchie's collection. And the hallways, and you see more of a hotel look to it than an institution. And that's also decked out for Christmas. And here's one more image of it. And on the grounds, here was these elaborately landscaped pleasure grounds. This was the main entrance. This was located right about where 31 crosses US 20, right about on the middle of that bridge. And if you were going south from Elgin on what is now 31, outside the left-hand side of the picture, you veered off that way and you went around that long arc of a road around the grounds. If you went straight in, you went straight into the grounds. If you went right, you went around towards the farm part of the hospital. And then here's a couple of pictures of the way the grounds were landscaped. The guy that designed the landscaping for that was a guy named John Blair, who was hired back to design the landscaping for Lawrence Park. He was a landscape architect, and he did some parks in Chicago and ended up in Vancouver, where he did a huge park there. But all these little settees and bridges and other little features, the conservatory.
Bridge over what?
What?
That's the big bridge over what?
That bridge? That's over a landfill now. That was a little walking path. It went over a gully that ran across the grounds.
Oh, thank you.
So, but long gone, and when the Depression was there, they just started throwing old buildings in it. So sad. Okay, so, and also the grounds had some of the other early stages of things that were necessary as it developed into its own little community. Firehouse, and these little buildings for the shops to maintain the property and that. And the farm. The farm was a big part of it. Farm was a big part of almost all residential institutions in the country. So they were all expected to, it was a rural agrarian society. So farm was part of life, and it was not only a place to raise food to help offset costs, but it was also a place to, for the patients to participate in helping out. Okay, and there are a few scattered houses on the grounds for some of the higher level employees. All the clinical people, all the doctors and the aides lived in the main building with the patients. But this is the house of the head farmer and a couple other people that had little houses around on the grounds. So, okay, so a quick look as we set this early phase of what's going on. So who are the employees then? Well, first of all, most were young and they were unskilled and they were single. There was no housing for lower level employees on the grounds at that time. If you worked there, you lived there, but if you were married and you were just an aide, there was no place for your spouse to live. And they kind of fixed that in the 1910s and 20s, be able to attract more help. By the 1950s, there was a lot of married couples living on the grounds. Most of those couples, one person or both people, I mean, were working there. Okay, so many people were just looking for temporary employment, coming and going. They're young people, that's how it is in life. And there were equal number of men and women employees, and there were equal number of men and women in direct care at the time. Direct care being the attendants and the doctors, no female doctors to the 1890s. So in 1880, is 98 employees, 520 patients there. And there was a high, these jobs, as time went on, the pay scale did not keep up with the industrial jobs that were developing in Elgin. And so there higher and higher turnover of staff, becoming a problem in terms of recruiting and retaining people. Yeah. Liz, what are you doing? Oh, okay. Liz is taking my picture. Okay, so here's a couple of pictures. Some people came and stayed a long time. This lady, Sarah Allison Cox, came as a young woman and she stayed through a lot of her career. And there she is right there as a lead supervisor with her latest crop of young attendants. Yeah. And here's a darling picture from Peter Hennessy's, one of his relatives. Anyone knows him? Gave that to me. And a couple others. And then we can't forget the whole group of people that maintain the facility. They, they're not to be forgotten because those are the tradespeople and all of that. Okay, so who were the patients? Well, this spans up to 1900, the first 6,953 patients. And after 1890, the patient population changes a bit. So this is skewed a little bit by that, but people didn't go there and stay there forever. 50% of the people were having their first attack of insanity. And that's what the goal was, to get early intervention, because your chances of recovery were best if you had treatment early on. And the discharges measured by Dr. Kilborn, 30% recovered, 25% improved. That's 55% rate. That's pretty good. And the 23% deceased, though, is a harbinger of what's coming. Because admission to the hospital at that time, all the counties were given a bed quota. And the doctor could reject that, the person, if he wanted to, but basically they didn't. And so the counties coming out of the county poor farms and other things in the county would be sending on people who were infirm, elderly, having problems, couldn't live on their own. And so some people were coming there at late in life, and that was part of the deceased population. And that becomes a big issue as we go forward in time. Okay, most of the patients were middle-aged people, but in that time period, as young as 12, maybe a little younger, and as old as 90 plus, and those 90 plus being people that obviously would pass on. And ethnicity, which was a huge issue in those days. A lot of pages of things written about why are we letting all these immigrants come? They're insane. Why are we letting them into our country? Blah, 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 blah. It's like, it's a familiar ring, maybe, but it's an old story. So in that time period, this is the ethnic mix of that first almost 7,000 patients, 50% US foreign. But of course, almost all those people have one or more parent that was born overseas. And then these were the prominent ethnic groups settling this part of the country in that time period. All right, so the issues of one era drive the change into the next era. And these are the issues of the 1880s and 90s. First is we're serving people who are recently ill, and we're serving people who are very sick and cannot be managed at home. And we're serving people who are so behaviorally disruptive they can't be managed at home. But we're not serving the chronically ill. So what are we going to do about that? The chronically ill are people who aren't going to get better. They're mentally ill. They're not going to get better. And we're not doing anything to serve them. So what are we going to do about that? And what are we going to do to have better medical services in the hospital? Because obviously where you have a lot of people living, you need better medical services. And so the great debate is, should we enlarge the existing hospitals, or should they build more hospitals all around in the range of about 600 beds? And that debate goes on through the 1880s, and it's sort of decided to go both ways. But it's decided initially with the hospitals that are running to enlarge them and then to add other ones here and there. So after 1892, which is an important election year because the Democrats come back into office with Altgeld, after 1892, cost cutting becomes a big issue. The cost of running the asylums is a big chunk of state government, and it becomes even bigger and bigger over time. But it's the Democrats, Altgeld's the first Democrat since before the Civil War. They've all been Republican governors up to then. It's a wedge issue. Where's your taxpayer dollar going? It's a wedge issue. And of course, what you want to do is just create, controversy or, whatever. So it becomes a political issue of the 1890s. And there is a constricting of more and more focus on cost cutting. Okay, so as we move into the 1890s, we go into this second phase. And what they're going to be doing in the second phase is they decided they're going to enlarge the social safety net. They're going to help the chronically ill. They're going to help the medically ill. They're going to provide services for them. And so there's going to be new missions and new patients. And naturally, that means it's a bigger hospital is going to have to come about. So you can see here what's happening in terms of the growth. The early days, the 600 beds or so, but after 1890, it begins to pick up, boom, boom, boom. The blue lines are the inpatient census on the end of those fiscal years I have up there. And the red lines are the admission rates. Those are the number of patients coming in and out into the hospital. And they may come in and stay, or they may come in and go back out. But you see the whole volume of activities on its way up. So by the 1920s, you got 2,700 patients, inpatients. And you're handling 1,500 admissions a year, which means you're handling about 1,500 discharges. That's a lot of activity going on. Far cry from the superintendent being able to watch everything. And it starts with this, the annex building, which is built specifically to deal with those chronically ill people. And it might superficially resemble the Kirkbride building, the center building, which is this building, by the way, just before it was demolished. That's the center building, the Kirkbride building. It might superficially resemble that, but it's significantly different in terms of the architecture. These corners are the dorms. Those are bedrooms for 20 people each, which means not only is there 20 people each in those rooms, but that means there's 80 people on this ward. Whereas those wards in the center building, they're about 25 people. So now we're getting more people in tighter spaces. And I'm just zoom in to make the point I just made. It's a different type of architecture. Whereas the Kirkbride building is a building designed as a therapeutic goal, this is designed as a housing option. And that turns out not a good one. And they also they built an infirmary, the start of an infirmary, named after William Wing, who was on the board of trustees, Wing Park. And here's a little peek into the parlor of that building. And so we get to 1910 and there's, as I say, there are more missions coming up. And the first mission they want to do is, what are we going to do about this? And these are, what are we going to do? I mean, these are the social welfare policy planners, the people running the system in Springfield. What are we going to do about the poor and aging and ailing in American society, which is going through a growth period? And you can see here, it's starting to take off by 1900, but it's really going to accelerate by 1940. So elderly people in that era, what do you do with them? They can't work. They got to be at home. Who's going to take care of them? Everybody else has got to go work. What are you going to do? What's the safety net for people that can't care for themselves? So that's a problem that they turn to these institutions to solve, because the institutions are running pretty well and it's the main resource. There is no other resource. So that's a problem that they turn to the institutions to solve, and they begin to enlarge them for that. So you start picking up new patients like these elderly ladies. And you pick up other, and I'll back up and say, before I get there, you start picking up other populations, smaller groups of populations. Much to the chagrin of the superintendents, you pick up the drug addicted, alcohol and drug addicted people, which were persona non grata in the mental hospitals of the 19th century. Why is that, you say?
No, I was just wondering, I mean, is it kind of a pseudo nursing home?
Okay, so what's happening is that when you're picking up these elderly people, you are evolving into a pseudo nursing home. There are no nursing homes in those days.
Oh, yeah,
I'll get to that in about 40 minutes. Okay, so you're picking up these other populations. The main one that you first pick up, you pick up the chronically mentally ill, and you picked up the elderly. And so you begin to build buildings, modest-sized buildings on the grounds to house these people. And here's some examples. Here's a look in the day room of the building that just up, Woods Cottage. And these other ones are modestly sized buildings for these purposes, but they're outbuildings. They're not all under one roof. And that changes the way that the medical staff deal with people because they're stretched thin. And a TB. So you pick up a population. Tuberculosis is always a problem in institutions up to the invention of antibiotics for it. And that plus it's a problem in the general population. So you're picking up TB patients amongst others. Yeah. So in 1919, they built a brand new general hospital, such a cool building that it's used in a paint ad by Sherman Williams. So there it is. And they'll take just a little peek in the door there of that building. So here, this is a typical medical ward of the early 19th century. And, you know, now, a bigger place needs a bigger infrastructure. So pretty soon you need a bigger storehouse, you need a bigger laundry, you need a bigger power plant, you need a bigger this, a bigger that, everything. It's growing pains. So along comes World War I, and suddenly there's a whole other mission that appears, and that is veterans. And so when the war ends and the Germans are routed, the government extends benefits to the veterans. But the Veterans Bureau, as it's called then, the forerunner of the Veterans Administration, doesn't have the bed space to serve them all. So the state hospital system becomes part of it. And that's for me, tell them I'm busy. So the state, Lorraine, was that you? Okay, you're forgiven. Okay, so the state hospital system, certain hospitals start picking up a veterans population and serving that as well. And this is the first building of that process, and they kind of pitch it as a hospital within a hospital. The veterans operations are partially funded by the US government, and the veterans are kept separate from the other psychiatric patients. But look at the buildings they're building now. These buildings, this is the bedroom. This is the day room. It's basically just 3 large rooms, the dining room, day room, and the dorm for these guys. And what's it look like inside? Like this. So these buildings were designed by the state architect, and they were designed with the window spacing based on the size of the window, the size of the beds, with the idea that there would be one bed between each window. And yet by 1927, they've already doubled up the number of beds in these places. And of course, there's no privacy here. There's no place for personal belongings. You know, it's the erosion of the values of the center building of the ideal asylum. And it's going on. There's growth by the middle 1920s of different, you know, there's 19,000 people in state institutions, and the number of institutions is up to 21. Yeah. Okay, I just threw this one here real quick because another whole great interesting side story, which I can't get into today, has to do with the battle between patronage and civil service, which goes on. It takes a long time. It takes 20 years to play itself out, and even longer. And basically what it was is this: all the people in that orange bar, those are all governors that fought against civil service and favored patronage. And all those that are in the lower black bar area, those are people who pushed civil service and progressive ideas and patronage. And why was patronage bad? Because every time the governor's office changed, they threw out all the existing managerial staff. And then it gradually, over time, it gradually creeped down into the workers level. They just cleaned house. So you had this constant churning and turning over of things, and you defeated the whole idea of people having a career path, especially the managers. And so you lost your institutional memory in that. And even after civil service comes in about 1910, which provides some standardization and merit selection and so on and so forth, not collective bargaining. But even after it comes in 1910, when you get to 1920s, Len Small is probably the most colorful and corrupt governor in Illinois history, bar none. None of the famous ones you know. So he devised all kinds of ways to get around the civil service system. But that's a whole long other story. It's in the book and all that. But look up Len Small and you'll see he's elected governor while he's been indicted for embezzlement while he's the treasurer. And just as a little tease for that, and I'm wasting too much time on this. So he's tried for embezzlement, but he's not convicted. But miraculously, 8 of the jurors get jobs in state government. And so when they try his cronies for jury tampering, they're not convicted. And miraculously, 6 of those guys get state jobs. So, you know, it's a long struggle from the 1890s to the 1920s on that. I just threw that in there to do that. Something also happens in the 20s is the type of patient begins to change. It's changing fast. And here's an example. And here's some, here's 1925, there's 2,777 patients at the end of June of that year. Here's the important things about this. So 58% of them suffer from dementia precox, which is the early name for schizophrenia. This means these are people that are seriously, seriously ill, and they're probably not going to get better. Another 14% are people with dementia, elderly people with dementia, and for whatever cause it is related to old age, you know, stroke or Alzheimer's or trauma or whatever. So right there, you see you have 70, my math right, 72% of patients, they're not going anywhere. And the other thing you're seeing is that 88% of them are first-time admissions. So you're bringing in people at the end, a lot of them at the end of life are people that are seriously ill in one way or another. You're bringing them into the institution. And another significant fact is this: deaths are going up in the hospital because the hospital is turning into not only a nursing home, but a hospice. People come for the last stages of life. 40% of those deaths are from paresis, which is, anybody? End stage of syphilis. End stage of syphilis, you know, when your brain is eaten away. Syphilis is a big, big public health problem in the late 19th and early 20th century, but it's not talked about. And there's no, once the Wasserman test comes in the early 1900s, you could detect syphilis, but you can't treat it. So it becomes more apparent as to why this person's deteriorating cognitively. So the patient mix is changing in the 1920s. It's different than the earlier era. Okay, so now we get to the 1930s to the 1950s, into the third phase of the hospital's evolution. And here the hospital becomes gigantic in size. And so in 1929, there's 10 buildings under construction for 1,200 new beds to be added to the grounds. There's already 2,700 beds. Now they're going to add 1,200 more with these 10 new buildings. But bam, there's the Depression. It hits the national economy. It hits the state economy. It, of course, has its effect on the state hospital. In 1932, the state hospital's budget's cut 30% in that 1 year, 30% cut. And in the official reports, it cheerfully says, there's no diminishment in services to the patients. You know, this is in the internet, you don't believe everything you read. So even back then. But the Depression turns out to be both a good and bad thing for the hospital. I'll explain the good part in a minute. So then World War II comes, and it's another body blow to the state hospital system because all the young men are drafted and all the physicians are taken away. And of course, there's the shortages of all the goods and services that go to support a hospital. And then in the after war years, this burgeoning population of elderly and infirm people just overwhelmed the system. So this is the next phase of the hospital, this thing. And it results in this extreme overcrowding after World War II. So let's start off with the good part of the Depression. And it's based on the medical staff. And this guy with the ring around his head, that's Dr. Charles Reed. He's the superintendent. He comes there. He rejuvenates the hospital in a lot of ways. He elevates it to a level it hadn't been to before, despite the Depression. One of the nice things about the Depression was that it was a job and it stabilized the workforce. You had a job and you had a place to live and people came and they stayed. But it also attracted a number of, through the power of personality of Dr. Reed and what programs he set up, he attracted a number of people, psychiatrists or alienists they were called, coming in to the work at the hospital for training and staying. And he also attracted a number of refugees from Nazi Germany, Jewish doctors from Nazi Germany and Austria that came and worked at the hospital during the 1930s. And it's not in this picture, this particular year in 36, but he also brought in women to work. Not a lot of them, but certainly some of them, like 2, 3, 4 women, because, you know, psychiatry was an all old boys sport. The women didn't have a place to get in, but he brought them in and welcomed them in, and that there's a lot of people. So I tracked down many people that were trained there during the 30s, and some of them had some pretty interesting careers after they left Elgin. So Reed also elevated training for the employees in a lot of different ways. And some of that training also went, the hospital, after board certification for neurology and psychiatry came in, Elgin was one of the places that you could do a residency. And also Reed put together a motion picture to go out and train the public. It's sort of a PR picture called Recovery. It's a 30-minute motion picture, traces the one patient's travels in, through, and out of the hospital. It was used for public presentations and lectures to educate that. But there was training, and it wasn't just training from the medical standpoint, but this guy, Anton Boyson, is attracted to there. And Boyson sets up a program to train clergy to work in psychiatric hospitals and other institutions. It's a very important and successful program for that. Goes on for all the way up, still goes on today, but all the way up to Boyson's death in the 50s and 60s. He also attracts a biochemistry research lab, which is where that research on nutrition comes out of, as well as medications and some other stuff having to do with the endocrine system and things like that. And that's a big plus. And Reed encourages all the staff, all the professional staff, to write articles for journals, and he publishes these in a series of journals during the 1930s, which gets a national play. And at one point in the late 30s, Elgin's identified as one of the 10 best research facilities for mental illness in the country. 6 of those 10, though, are universities. The other 4 are hospitals. It's hard to run a hospital and a research at the same time.
What year was that?
I think it was 36, 37, somewhere in there. The Depression also brings some Public Works Administration money in. So there's a little bit of building. Illinois is very good at attracting this money in that time period. And there's new construction. Here's a diagnostic center being built. And here's a little peek into the day room. And here's a little peek of the office area. And here we have, this is the cafeteria of the farm colony, which had moved from the main campus out to McLean Boulevard. And here's the guys on a TB ward, young men on this TB ward. And how would you like to be the attendant? If you didn't have TB when you started, you probably had it when you left. So here's the hospital library. And then these are a bunch of pictures coming up of the social world that grows up inside the hospital from the 19th century. I write a lot about this in the book. It's a very interesting story. Goes on through the 1930s and 40s and 50s. Everybody's living on the ground, so everybody's mixed in. Their social world's mixed in with their work world. Here's one of my favorite pictures, and probably related to 4th of July or Labor Day picnic, softball game late in the day. The hospital band is on that little dais there in the back. Here's a picture of the marching band. It's made up of patients, the employees as the band leaders. And also very musical. There's the orchestra, and there's the choir. And a picnic grove down at the riverside. And the greenhouse is converted into an activity center. This is set up for Valentine's Day. And this guy, Peter Host, he comes to, in the middle of the Depression, he comes to the doctor, he says, look, can I set up a little refreshment stand outside the fence here? I got to make a living. I got to be able to do that. And he does. And it ends up, he doesn't work at the hospital, but his daughter works there. And his granddaughter ends up working there for years. And so, and here you asked about where that bridge was. This is that part that got filled in. But here we have the staff working side by side with the patients to maintain the grounds. That labor pool of the patients, very important. Here they are doing building maintenance, working in the wood shop. Yeah, there's a little sign up there. It says, keep busy and smiling, be happy. How can you go wrong with that, guys? So I see you're smiling, you must be happy. So, very good. Okay, so again, the patient's a big part of the labor force for the hospital. The farm, the kitchens and canning. This is canning in the harvest season. And it's all documented very well in the hospital newsletter, which is like a small town newspaper. Valuable insight into day-to-day life in the 30s. You know, the grounds had, you know, there's a bowling alley, there's a movie theater, there's a dance hall, there's clubs and all this. It's a whole city unto itself. And that's how they distributed it in those days, just on bulletin boards. Okay, so by 1941, the number of patients statewide are up to 43,000. Half of the state budget is taken up running the social welfare system of the state hospital and its related institutions. 1941. Then what happens? World War II comes. And of course, it's a body blow for the hospital, as it is for the whole country. And pretty soon, the doctors and the young men that were working at the hospital, now the doctors have other things to look into. Because they're all gone off to the army. And the war is only 4 years for America. It's only about 4 years, 3 years and 9 months. Same amount of time you were in high school, really. And after the war, everybody comes marching back home, but nobody marches back home to the state hospital. The doctors don't come back. Private practice is too lucrative. The GIs don't come back because, you know, the industries where the jobs are, the GI Bill takes you to college, they don't come back. Yeah. So there's a huge labor shortage during the war and a huge labor shortage after the war. And what's happening meanwhile in the population of the hospital? Again, the blue line, up, 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 up. And so by 1954, September of 1954, there's 6,844 patients in-house and another 600 off grounds, like hospital visits or home visits or whatever. There's 500 employees living on the grounds. So you have a city by 1954, you have a city there of like 7,000 people, when the city of Elgin was about, without the hospital, was about 40,000. And the city or village of South Elgin is about 1,000, 7,000 people in that city. So, and the system is overwhelmed. And to borrow from the nuclear age, it's critical mass. It's completely imploding on itself. It cannot keep up. The state government operations are antiquated. The funding, the state tax revenue is down. They can't even meet payroll. Payroll shows up from Springfield 2, 3, 4 weeks late. It's terrible. You can't get supplies. Everything's falling apart. And it results, and it's not just at Elgin. It's going on nationwide. That's the value of everywhere in the country. This is going on. All the state hospitals are withering like this. So what happens is you have these exposés, Mary Jane Ward, Snake Pit, her book, and then it comes out into a film. And somebody asked, was that filmed at Elgin? No, it was not. It wasn't filmed there. It was filmed on a soundstage in Hollywood, and the exterior scenes were shot at some state hospital in California. But Mary Jane Ward eventually lived out in Plato Center. So, but remember I showed you this picture, how they've already doubled up the beds. Well, when we get to the 50s, they've put in even more, another row. And it doesn't look so bad when it's all clean and the beds are made. But look at when you put human beings into these conditions. And so these are the elderly, infirm, bedridden patients. At this point, the hospital is 167% of capacity. And most of that crowding is on these back wards, these infirmary wards. And it's just unbelievably overwhelming and understaffed and pathetic. And it's, again, not just here, it's everywhere in the country. It's so bad that the state can't even provide beds for all the patients. And they're having that problem at all the state hospitals. It's so bad. Conditions are so bad. And here's a fairly good ward, probably a veterans ward. Look, these guys are pretty nicely dressed. Spartan environment, but you know, they're wearing suits, probably Sunday. But when you get to these back wards, these are horrific conditions. This is a woman's ward, obviously, and these are people that are totally psychotic, very, very severely ill. You can't keep them clothed. You can't keep them, dressed. These ladies in the front are wearing what we call strong dresses made out of canvas because people just shred their clothing. And there's this constant pacing and noise and people striking each other and screaming and yelling going on. These are just incredibly deplorable conditions. Yeah. So this is the early 50s. So we're up to here. There's a lot more material on this in the latest edition of the book. Makes for very sad but very informative reading. And who's holding it together? A little stream of these technicians, these aides, coming in, and these. This is a group of nurse supervisors of the 50s. They were just given an award that day. I took this picture. These are the people that are holding it together by a thread. Like that. Okay, so as we get into the 60s now, the whole system begins to, it's imploded. Things are happening. So what's going to happen? It's going to all come apart here pretty quick. And that leads to a downsizing of the hospital, which kicks us into a different era. And it's a reconfigured system of care. So everybody kind of knows this story in a way. And of course, medications play a huge role in kicking this off. Because these new psychotropic medications allow hundreds of people to be able to get out of the hospital that otherwise were stuck there for years. But, and then people also say it's community mental health. Well, community mental health really begins after World War II in one way or another. It gets a big shot in the arm in the 60s with the Kennedy administration. And, you know, Kennedy's particularly sensitive about this because his sister was mentally retarded and institutionalized and that. But the community mental health doesn't really impact the state hospital system for another 20 or 30 years because it's dealing with a different type of patient. It's dealing with outpatient. The state hospital is dealing with people that have to be 24-hour supervision, a lot of care, medical attention, so on and so forth. That's not who the community mental health center is dealing with at that time. So there are engines of change coming though, and they're largely money driven. And these are some of the factors, and I'll show you why. It is medications, not so much community mental health yet. It's Social Security disability, it's Medicare, Medicaid. To a small extent, it's the patient rights movement of that era, a spin-off of the Civil Rights Unit. And here's the real engine of change. It's the old story, follow the money. So in the original model, the state pays for the hospital, the patients come to the hospital, they get treated. In the emerging model, through entitlements of disability, SSI, Medicare, Medicaid, the money gets attached to individual people, individual patients. And then theoretically, then that patient could go somewhere else if those services exist. That's when the nursing home industry just mushrooms in size because most people in nursing homes are people that are on Medicaid. And that allows a big deinstitutionalization of patients that could go into those environments like that. So the money shift is important. The money also shifts in that now the federal government's involved as well as the state, and the state's more than happy to get those federal dollars to take some of the load off of them. And they begin to also really beef up the community mental health agencies during this time period with state money and federal money. And there's another big element that comes into it at this time. It's a whole new type of worker. It's not the aide who was equivalent of a servant in the 19th century. And it's not the doctor because there's so few of them. It's the caseworker, grassroots kind of caseworker. And these are people that are hired, you know, from college and community colleges and they're trained to be what the hospital needs them to be as caseworkers. They bring in a new energy to the whole system. And there's all these other changes that are taking place in the 1960s. The whole system's changing. The whole culture of the hospital is changing. The whole method of treatment's changing. Everything's up in the air. Everything's turning over. Everything's different. It's entering into another era. And there's a little bit of construction at Elgin in the 1960s. This either mid-century modern gem or eyesore, depending on your architectural taste. But this was the medical building replacing the other hospital. Bertram Goldberg designed this. He designed Marina City. There's several other hospital buildings. So it's that. And I know people are always dying to know what it looked like inside. Oh, here's a picture inside. So it's kind of like being on a Starship Enterprise. Got that big curved thing. It was great. So anyway, and then the administration building, which is still there. But both of these buildings, because things are changing so fast, both those buildings really only have a service life of about 35 years. They're both on the to be demoed list these days. There's no purpose for them anymore. Yeah, and there's a little bit more going on. Remember, this is the annex building being demolished in 1972. And in the background is the rehab building being built, which is for staff training, but also a rehab workshop because there's no more free patient labor. That's all gone. And the labor is in the shelter workshop where the patients are earning, you know, their own money. That's another change that's going on. So most of the campus though is aging out. And as the population of the patients begins to dwindle, buildings are shut down, abandoned, and there's a huge number of buildings, like over 100 buildings on the campus, including the farm colony buildings, and the place is getting, except for these few changes, is getting worn out looking. and semi-used, not used, and abandoned. So what we see though is you can see the number of inpatients dropping like a rock in these 20-year period. You're going from, that must be like around 4,600 down to under 1,000 in that 20-year period. It's a change of things. It brings us into yet another phase of the hospital's existence. So, and the money is going into the community, not into the state hospital system. And as you can see here, so the hospitals are, the state hospital system is increasingly obsolete. So here they are, they're closing. And when we get down to this period, we're down to this. Which hospital is going to close? Manteno, which is down in Kankakee County, or Elgin? And so this is on the headlines. It's the word is that Elgin's going to close. That's the private word. That's what's told to the politicians. That's what's told to the city council, the chamber of commerce, all of whom yawn and say, oh, well, okay, we don't care. It's the way it goes. I shouldn't say all the politicians, because Jim Kirkland, who was our state rep then, was very big in saying, hey, does this make sense? And so what happens is that here's the employees at this is the old city council chambers, making a plea to the city council, help us out, let us do something like that. It's a futile effort. The city council is not going to decide the fate of the hospital. That's going to be decided by the governor. And of course, the governor decides to keep Elgin open. And to his great credit, that kicks us into the next phase. It's the rebirth of the hospital. And the first part of that starts out like with the rebuilding of it, and it leads to the next phase, the forensic patient, which start coming into the hospital at this point. There always have been forensic patients, but becomes more and more important. So what's a forensic patient? Here's a quick summary. Well, we'll get to those guys in a second. Thompson says, no question, Elgin's going to stay open. And it's because Thompson, to his great credit, and the director of the department, a guy named Mike Bellatier at the time, they take on a very detailed, very thorough analysis of the mental health system and what's going on. Elgin, Galesburg, Manteno. And this guy named Richard Hunter does this. And they look at things like which facility has the better physical plant, which facility has the sicker patients, which facility has the capacity to pick it up, which facility has the other jobs in the area that people could go to, state jobs, which facility is better positioned to recruit new professional people, which facility has the stronger clinical team. And on those points and a bunch more, Elgin wins out, hands down. So even though Lieutenant Governor George Ryan is from Kankakee County, where Manteno is, even though him and Thompson are there, even though that happens, Jim Thompson decides that Elgin's going to stay open. And but it's identified that Elgin's forensic program and Manteno is going to merge together, because the forensic patients, and who are they? Here's what a forensic patient is. If there's a crime committed and an arrest is made, the first thing that happens is in the pretrial phases, you say, can the patient cooperate in their defense? And if the answer is yes, you go to trial. And if the answer is no, you go to the state hospital and you get treated until you're able to cooperate in your defense. That's called unfit to stand trial. And usually people are in for about 90 to 120 days, and they could get back into the trial process. They go to trial, and if they're guilty, well, you go to jail or whatever else the sentence is. If you're not guilty, you go home right when you find work. Nice seeing you. And if you're found not guilty by reason of insanity, you get sent back to the state hospital. So laws change in this time period. The state hospital previously had the prerogative to discharge people when they thought they were ready, but it changes in this time period. And that prerogative to discharge is taken away from the hospital and stays with the court system. And so gradually, and the courts are very, very conservative about discharging not guilty by reason of insanity patients. So gradually, the population of these forensic patients is going up, 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 up. And this goes on throughout the 80s and continues on. Yeah. Okay, so at the same time that the Thompson agrees that we're going to rebuild Elgin and accommodate all these patients from Manteno and all these other things, there's another thread coming, equally as important, and that's the U.S. Justice Department. The U.S. Justice Department is looking at state hospitals all over the country, and they're mostly looking at state mental health systems, and they use investigations of hospitals to leverage themselves into lawsuits against the state because the services are substandard. And the people running the hospitals, like in Illinois, as one, they're okay with this because they know if they enter into litigation with the Justice Department, they could get to a consent decree where everybody agrees we're going to do X, Y, and Z to upgrade these hospitals, which is what the Justice Department wants. They don't want to run the hospital, they want to upgrade it. And the people that are running the mental health system want to upgrade it too, because they're aware of what the conditions are. And a consent decree insulates the hospital from budget cuts and allows money to pour into the hospitals. So it's the Justice Department combined with the closing of Manteno, the influx of money that's going to rebuild Elgin. So here's the Justice Department. It does just what I just explained. They're particularly focused on the quality of the psychiatry and the use of medications and the side effects of medication and how you're going to monitor this. And they're particularly interested in professionalizing the staff that are dealing with the patients. So all those caseworkers of that earlier generation now are getting retread as psychologists and social workers and masters and doctor level people like that. So, and the Justice Department's lastly focused on the physical plant. They want a decent physical plant brought up to speed. And that's good. It insulates Elgin. It pours a lot of resources into Elgin. Here's Governor Edgar talking about how they're going to consolidate the grounds. The number of patients are way down. We're going to let go of the north end of the grounds. We're going to rebuild the south end of the grounds. And so there's another round of demolition in the 1990s. The old center building, Kirkbride building, obsolete, no good anymore. It's gone. Other buildings demolished, gone. New buildings being constructed, being brought online, and the size of the hospital campus during this time period changes. Much more compact, brand new in a lot of ways. Yeah. So I just got to put in a plug for these guys. These are facility directors of that time in succession, because sometimes the guys that carry the water don't get to stand on the podium at the end of the day. And so these facility directors, along with the Justice Department, many other staff, they work to build Elgin back up. And it results in not only accreditation by the national organization, Joint Commission Accreditation Hospital, but it results in the accreditation cycles are 3 years. Accreditation in 94 and 97, Elgin's accredited with accommodation. Only 5% of the hospitals in the country are accredited with accommodation. That puts Elgin in the top 5% of hospitals in the nation. And they don't do that accommodation thing anymore with the Joint Commission accrediting hospitals. But it's thought that that's the only public hospital to ever be accredited with accommodation twice in a row. So by the late 90s, Elgin's, it's hitting on all cylinders. New physical plant, good staffing, lots of stuff going on. It's integrating more with the outpatient services. Everything's going in its favor. And then the last phase happens, the phase that we're in now. And it really starts, it's a financial story that drives it. First, the national financial situation cripples the state's financial situation. And the first blow is 9/11, when the economy just tanks. And actually, people forget about it, but the economy was slowing down before 9/11 anyway. And the second blow is the Great Recession, where the economy just tanks. And then the third blow is the state's own inability to solve its political and financial problems. in that. So the impact on the hospital system is the hospital system turns away from all those non-forensic patients as it's treating them. And it focuses out only on the forensic population because that's the population that cannot be treated anywhere else. So the non-forensic population is diminished. Governor Ryan hastily begins to try to slash the budget. By the time he gets to the third round of budget cuts, 500 million he's looking for, he's looking at the, the safety, social safety net. And for Elgin, he wants to cut 150 beds. This is in 2002 and 305 employees. That's, there's 1,200 employees. You're gonna get rid of 305 of them. Well, through a whole bunch of back and forth with the politicians and this and that, and the state comes up with the idea of early retirement initiative, which allows people to buy in. It's not a buyout. You have to pay to get in. You can buy more years on the retirement system. They can offload active employees to the retirement system. So in 2002, it wasn't 300 employees that left. It was 415 employees that left through layoffs, transfers, and some in the retirements. You lost 1/3 of the workforce in a 9-month period in 2002. And at the same time, you can see that population is going down, the hospital population is going down. The number of admissions is also dropping because you dropped off all of those non-forensic people. And here's a little chart of how that works. These are forensics in the hospital. These are non-forensic. You see, it's just dwindles. And actually, by the time you get down here, there's a lot of forensic people in this yellow section because they're sort of redefining them based on their long-term need. They're not calling them forensic anymore, but they essentially are forensic patients. So as you get into this time period, though, the hospital morphs again into some other thing that's not recognizable to the previous time periods. These are some of the trends, though, that come along in this period. And they're good and they're healthy. And you have the more research and studies being done at the hospital, which give a lot of publicity to it at the national level. And you have this other thing. You have this, what I call a forest fire effect. It greatly compacts the layers of bureaucracy. And, it gets rid of a lot of dead wood. It gets rid of a lot of live and good wood, but it allows a whole other generation of younger people to come up and assume the management roles in that. And the other thing is, they immediately downsize 100 beds out of the non-forensics and more to come, but they begin these other ways of dealing with things. And some things get dropped. There's no doubt about it. You can't lose that much and not have it dropped. But after a couple of years, they really get back on their feet and things are really looking pretty good. And their hospital, because of the research and that, it is gaining national, regional, national, and international recognition. Whoops. Part of it is this very prestigious award, only 10 hospitals in the country doing that. And a long backstory to that, I won't get into it. But you're seeing people coming in, not only from other states, there's people coming from other countries. These people are from Japan. They're coming to see what's going on at Elgin. How can we learn from this? And there's 3 other countries that people came from, other 3 in Europe and that. But there's also people coming from around the country. So it's a very, after they get back on their feet, not without their problems, not without their subsequent layoffs, not without all the other hassles that go with day-to-day life, but the place is going pretty good. Okay, so now we're almost at the end. How'd you like a quick tour of the hospital today? Huh? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sure. Come this way. We come this far, might as well go in. Okay, these pictures I took before COVID. So they're a little dated, but it's essentially that. So these are some of the new buildings that were built in the late 90s, in the early 2000s. And you can see clean, modern. You can't have pictures of patients, of course, but like that. And that, and you see this guy here?
See a patient?
He's a patient, he's standing right there. It's Doug. Doug was a nurse at the hospital. In fairness, Doug was a nurse. So anyway, so we're glad to see Doug's here and not there. So here, very quick run through on all this kind of stuff. And here's the workshop at the there. In the library, the new library. Yeah. In the work areas, I mean, it's clean, it's modern, it's, you know, it's what you want. There's a little courtroom on the grounds, gymnasium, a visiting area for families. Yeah. So that's the policy story. That's the policy that drives the hospital through all these different incarnations. This little plaque was in the hallway when the hospital first opened. It's still there. And it is still these inspiring words of attributed to Dr. Kilborn, but you know, somewhere around there. Yeah. Okay, so now if you slept through some of this and you want to see this story again, I'll be doing it at Gale Borden Public Library next month, probably a little bit quicker version too. So you really got the, you know, the longer one. And I'm also doing what I do every year is a tour of the hospital cemetery, which is a very interesting place. And that's in May right there. So, and the last thing in the world of shameless commerce is a rewrite of the history book of it from the 1997 book, adding these last 25 years, better layout, more pictures. A lot of things expanded on because I've been doing research and lectures for years. So it's a much fuller, completer story in larger context of the hospital's history of that. And so it's at the printer now. So we're in pre-publication sales, $5 off if you order it today. And there it is. And you could talk to Liz wherever she went, or there she is. And pick it up today, order it, or take an order form home with you and think about it and all of that. So that is all I have to say. And that's enough. All right. Yeah. All right. Quickie question. You had a quickie question? Okay, the question was, were there ever children at the hospital? Yes, there always were children at the hospital up to 1977. And then they gathered all the children to a central program in the Chicago area. So there weren't any children after that at the hospital. In fact, by law, you can't have children there. Okay. No, it's going to be actually, I have to compact it. Most of you were still, well, I know, there's a ton more. There's a lot of great stories here, and you got to read the book. There's more stuff there, but I ran over on time and I shouldn't have done that, but anyway, so there's that. Part two, buy me a beer and I'll give you part 2 and 3. So, all right, well, let's do this. You were here, you were first, so I didn't see. What's the question?
Question is for the forensic patients, and with so many other hospitals closing, do we only get people from Illinois or do we get people from Chicago?
Okay, so do we only get forensic patients from Illinois? Yes, we only get patients from Illinois, people that were charged in Illinois, which is essentially all Illinois patients. Yes, and ma'am. Okay, where do we sign up for the mental health cemetery tour? You could show up. We meet at 10 o'clock on that Saturday morning, the 14th. You know where the Grumpy Goat restaurant was? The Highlands Golf Course, the sports complex. Okay, so we meet in the parking lot that's just beyond the restaurant. It's right by the driving range. And then we car caravan to the cemetery. And it takes about an hour to walk around and hear the few stories. You get a few good war stories out of that event. So, sir.
What years did you work at the hospital? In what capacity?
Oh, that's a long story, but So I worked from 1974 to 2002. And I had, I started out as a technician, a caseworker, and then assistant unit director and unit director. Then I was assistant in charge of central admission service, and then in charge of admission service, then in charge of medical records, utilization review. Then I was a court liaison. Then I was in charge of information services. Then I was in charge of getting the hell out of there. So- All right, anybody else want? What? Oh, you know that picture of the courtroom? That's where I got married. Francella and I got married there. I worked in that room for about in the 15 years, every Friday doing the court stuff. And so, and the Judge Halleck was a friend of mine. So when we decided to get married after our 29 years courtship, I said, let's do it there. So we did it there. Very special place for us. Okay, ma'am.
How does Elgin compare to the other state hospitals that were in Illinois?
How does it compare?
Yeah.
Well, that's a complex. How does Elgin compare? The question is, well, how does Elgin compare? That's a very complicated, complex answer.
At Elgin and the other facilities?
Depends on the era. Depends on the era. They certainly were more recently and in the 1930s, and I'd say in the 1870s and 80s. Yes, but it's a complicated question to answer. Another long one.
A lot of the hospitals that are now gone were, like the zone center.
Yeah, Fran says a lot of the hospitals that are gone now were zone center. That's a whole, it's a deep, it's a very deep, it's actually the zone center story is a very interesting one. You got to read about in the book. It's how the state hospitals, the old state hospitals were sucked dry of money, and all the money went into these new hospitals called zone centers. And it's just when you dig into the finances of it, it's just a tragedy. The zone centers were being funded 3 times the rate of the state hospital in terms of per patient per day. So anyway, that's a long bitch. Pam?
Was the Reed guy at Elgin have anything to do with Chicago?
Yes, was Charles Reed at Elgin. He was, yes, he's the guy that Chicago Reed's named after. He was a superintendent at the predecessor to Chicago Reed, Chicago State, for a few years, but his 16 years at Elgin was the bulk of his career. So, yes. And he had died in 46, and so his memory is fresh. You know, the secret to get a place named after you is you got to die, and you got to have enough friends around for another 10 years to kind of promote your name. So. All right. Where? Way over there.
For those tests, the 50s and 60s, were they done on patients?
Tests?
Like to discover stuff?
Okay, so were patients used for in the testing for in the 50s and 60s? The biochemistry lab for a while was paired with a small unit that they tested nutritional things on with that. But you know, after World War II, testing, all things came under the purview of institutional review boards. And so the testing using human subjects became very strictly monitored and regulated all through the healthcare industry. So anyway, and you have one.
I do. In the those different early years, eras, how did they handle like involuntary committal? Were most of those people there and
Yeah.
controlled by someone?
Okay, so here's how it went. That's a long question, a long answer too. But the question was, how did they handle involuntary commitment in the early years? Well, it's like this. I'm trying to remember exactly when the years were. Initially, there was always commitment. There's always a process of committing people, but through a court process. And though for a period around the Civil War, the husbands could commit wives and children, they still had to go through a quasi court hearing process. That changed after that, where there was a public hearing and a court process. We had to give evidence and all of that, which was a mixed blessing because what happened was you brought people's private lives out into the public. That was the downside of it. The positive side of it was it discouraged people seeking help and that. So and it goes on and on and on. But the commitment laws, which are voluminous now, you could see the core of them by reading the statutes of the 1840s. Same basic process, that there should be evidentiary hearing, there should be testimony by physicians or qualified people, there should be a judge or a jury make a decision. That's a long story to get into. Well, oh, Jackie, way in the back.
Bellevue Place, in Batavia.
Yes.
There are a lot of boutique kinds of rest places.
Right, there was,
at the same time.
okay, she asked about Bellevue Place, which is where Mary Todd Lincoln was in the 1870s for about 6 months or so. There were very few boutique or private psychiatric centers in the whole state. And that was the case all the way up until about World War II. Very, very few, like numbered in, on one hand, up to a dozen statewide. And almost all of those were somewhere in the Chicago metropolitan area, nothing downstate. So, there's a piece on that in my book too. So, Bill?
I had, when I was in grade school in St. Joe's, we had a baseball team, and we would go out to the hospital and entertain patients.
Yeah.
The guys seemed okay, and I wondered what was going on. They were shell shock guys from World War II.
Could be. Bill says that when he was a kid, they would play baseball out the hospital grounds as part of the entertainment. Some of the people that he interacted with seemed okay. So yeah, there were a lot of people that the symptomatology was not evident, or they were there because they needed the degree of structure and support that wasn't available elsewhere. So, okay, anyone real quick to get done? Jennifer?
The question I get most asked is current numbers, how many forensic patients, how many deaths?
Yeah, or see, they're down about 3. Oh, man. They're down about 320, 330 in terms of patients, but they have, and they're scheduled to be up. They're going to bring on 2 more units that were being used by a Department of Corrections. So they're budgeted in the 370 range, something like that. And almost all are forensic in one way or another. So, and how many staff? About 600.
How many civil?
Just, a handful. Just like, half of one unit. 20, sort of, all the civil patients are offloaded to the community. So, all right, any real quick ones? Yes, you had your hand up, then we're gonna go.
They had large rooms, more people in the rooms.
Yes,
Were there safety concerns for the patients? And if so, what were they? How did they protect patients from each other?
okay, so the question was as these dormitories got larger and larger, were there safety considerations for the patients? Well, there were considerations, but there were no accommodations for it. And you ended up with these I was talking about like, especially in the 40s, 50s, early 60s, you ended up with these, gigantic day rooms in these gigantic dorms where you'd have a couple of employees on duty. That was it. And, you might be lucky on a heavy day to have maybe 3 or 4 people. That was it. I mean, it was tough. It was overwhelming. You could talk to like Fran or some people that worked there in those early days, Paige. And, even the units I worked on, boy, oh boy, unimaginable. So, okay. Yeah. Okay. That's enough. If people want to talk some more. Oh, online. Did we get anybody online? No. Okay. All right. Sorry. All you Zoomers, sorry. Chris says nobody was asked questions on Zoom. If you have a question, call me up, buy the book. Whatever. Bye.